Hello, my name is Allison Dupre Singleton. I'm a librarian at the Genealogy Center at the Allen County Public Library in Fort Wayne, Indiana. This session is the 1940 census and preparing for the 1950 census. Welcome. The content of this video, as well as the thoughts, views, and opinions expressed herein, belong solely to the creator and do not necessarily reflect the views of FamilySearch International and RootsTech. When looking at any topic, it is always good to look at the background. Let's take just a couple minutes to talk about the background of the census. The purpose is to determine the apportionment in Congress. It's also used to look at the location of new housing and public facilities. It's to plan transportation systems, roadways, determine quotas, creation of police and fire precincts, to create localized areas for elections, schools, utilities, etc. It's very important. It's taken every 10 years, beginning in 1790, and for privacy reasons, it's closed to the public for 72 years after it's taken. Where are the records housed? The National Archives is the official steward of these records. You can find microfilm in various libraries, but you can also find it digitized on a lot of different databases, free and paid. The Census Bureau is under the Department of Commerce and Labor. Enumeration districts are important to note, or an ED. It is an administrative division of a particular county or township for the purpose of census taking. The census taker would be assigned one or more ED, and each ED is designated with a number. The records are supposed to reflect the ages, births, and deaths as of the official census day. From 1790 to 1820, it was the first Monday in August. From 1830 to 1900, it was June 1st. 1910, April 15th. 1920, January 1st. 1930 to 1950, April 1st. Enumerators and informants didn't always follow this guideline. Information could have been provided by anyone. Due to this, you have to take everything with a little grain of salt. If your ancestors weren't home, someone else could have given the information, or somebody in the house who was young or old who may not have known all the information. Enumerators were given specific instructions before they went out to take the census. Despite this, they didn't always listen to the instructions, and that's where a lot of mistakes could be made. And the recording of people's names varied from census to census, including nicknames, misspellings. You never know what could be put on a census. Let's look at the 1940 census. And the reason we want to do this before diving into the possibilities of the 1950 census is because it is so vitally important to know everything you can about your ancestors in the 1940 census before trying to look for them in 1950. We know from the 1940 Census Release that the 1950 census will not be indexed right away. It will probably be crowdsourced, just like the 1940 census, or other companies will pay people to index it as quickly as possible. It'll be a race. There'll be a lot of mistakes. Let's look at the 1940 census to remind ourselves what were the new questions and what other information should we pull out to look for in the 1950 census for comparisons or to find your ancestor on the 1950 census. In 1940, there were over 120,000 enumerators, and they surveyed 132 million people. The survey contained 34 questions plus 16 supplemental questions asked of only 5% of the population. The 1940 census was basically a national holiday when it was released, not just for genealogists, also historians. It was really interesting to look at the 1940 census as a snapshot in time. It was the greatest generation. You got to see what life was like in 1940 when we were on the brink of World War II. The country was in turmoil due to the Great Depression, how the New Deal provided occupations and other forms of work and aid for people, the Dust Bowl, and the Great Migration. Researchers could follow the movement of people across the country, and it could also take a look and see how people were living, what were their jobs before the war started. It is a really interesting piece of historical information that can be used to put your ancestors into historical context. This is a blank 1940 census form. The first time the census was advertised was in 1940. It was the biggest outreach and promotional campaign. The Census Bureau created the Division of Public Affairs to blanket the country with the message to take the census, reaching out to over 10,000 publications. And they recruited people like business owners, public officials, clergy, and even movie studios. There's even a photograph of President Franklin D. Roosevelt taking the census that was used for the campaign. To get an idea of the diversity of the United States in 1940, the Census Proclamation was translated into 23 languages. Now let's have a reminder of what is on the 1940 census. The new things. We have a lot of the very basic information that you've seen on census records before, but in 1940, it was the first time information was given on who furnished the information. Enumerators used an X with a circle around it to indicate who provided the information in the household. In the next portion, you can see a lot of similar information as before, but some new things are first time it asked what the highest grade level was completed, and this is going to be the last time it's asked in the general census. In section 16, there's a little bit of a clarification. It's asking American citizen born abroad if his or her father was an American citizen and resided in the United States before the time of the child's birth on or before May 23rd, 1934. If the child was born at sea or overseas on or after May 23rd, 1934, the child is an American citizen if the mother or father are American citizens. So there's a little bit of a differentiation in that 1934 year. The Census Bureau was also tracking the migration of people with the 1940 census. If your ancestors migrated or you have an interest in the migration between 1930 and 1940, section 17 to 20 is of interest to see where people lived in 1935. The next part is about occupation. Now, normally it would just say, what's the occupation? Where did they work? That type of thing. Well, because of the New Deal and what was going on in the country, they're actually asking if the person was at work for pay or profit in private or non emergency government work. Public emergency work would be the WPA, the NYA, the CCC, etc. The Census Bureau was asking whether people were employed through New Deal programs such as the WPA. They're asking if people are seeking work, if they own a business, if they have a job. It was also asked if they were unable to work or if something else was going on to prevent them from having a job. The census also asked how many hours people were working in a week. Another question was how long have they been unemployed if they were unemployed? The next part should be familiar since it's asking about occupation and industry. The next part of the census asks about income. This is kind of interesting because of the Great Depression, seeing what the income of people was during this time period. And they did test these questions out. Actually, they did a test run in Indiana to see what questions people would balk at answering. And this is one that some people did balk at, but they decided to include it anyways. I would venture a guess that it was probably because of what was going on with the Great Depression and Dust Bowl and so many people being without work. The supplementary questions, 35 to 50, as with most of you, I wish my family was part of the 5%. If you have family that's part of the 5%, congratulations. There's great information in here that I wish had been asked of everyone. Place of birth for father and mother, native tongue, veteran or child of a veteran, Social Security. Social Security numbers were new around this time, which makes this question a sign of the times. The last portion included questions for women who are or have been married. Has this woman been married more than once? Age at first marriage? Number of children ever born? It'd be great if that had been asked of every woman. Now that we've looked at the 1940 census and reminded ourselves what it was about, Let's look at how the numbers are probably going to change between 1940 and 1950 based on the statistics gathered by Life magazine in 1950 prior to the census being taken. It was a comparison between the 1930s and 1940s to give an indication of how things have changed and what things would look like in 1950. More infants were living. The number of births were up, and the number of deaths per thousand infants was down. There were more people, and this makes sense since we're in the baby boom generation. 1950, post war, we know it happened. More babies were born. Women were outnumbering men. What was interesting is that more men were being born, but women were living longer. That is what we're seeing by 1949. Women kept working. You had women going to work during the war at much higher rates. Rosie the Riveter, and a lot of them stayed at work. Now, this could be for various reasons. You had a lot of men at war. A lot of them didn't come back. If the woman was married, she would then be the primary breadwinner of the family. If she was the daughter of someone who died, she would probably have to help her family make ends meet. A lot of women also really enjoyed working and having spending money of their own. It is important to put our ancestors into historical context, which is what these statistics help us see going into the 1950 census. Divorce increased. Marriage increased too, and you can see that with that orange line with the marriage. And then you look at divorce and you see that it looks small. But if you look closer, you realize that the orange actually doubles the pink for divorce. It was a 100% increase in divorces from the 1930 to 39 period to the 1940 to 1949 period. Farming had changed. Machines were replacing men on farms. There were less people employed on farms and more tractors in use. Way of life had been changing and technology had been changing. The war changed so much. The 1950 census is going to be very interesting to look at. It's an exciting time for us as genealogists and as historians. The 1950 census. This is actually a page out of the Enumerator's Reference Manual. A couple of really interesting things that happened with the 1950 census is the UNIVAC 1 marked a major improvement in data processing. It was the dawn of the computer age as the first electronic computer designed for civilian use. The Census Bureau was working on this in the late 1940s, and it was first used on the 1950 census. It was able to tabulate 4,000 items per minute, which is double what the earlier machines were able to do. For the 1950 census, 142,963 enumerators visited every location in the United States and territories to count the nation's over 151 million people. Let's take a look at the census. This is a blank census form that has been chopped up into bite-sized pieces. You do have a copy of the entire form in your syllabus. A lot of the information in this first part is the typical that we've seen on other census records before. The serial number of the dwelling, if it's a farm, name, relationship to head, race, sex, how old the person was at their last birthday. Is this person now married, widow, divorced, separated, or never married? Separated is kind of interesting, and divorced, knowing what the numbers are for divorces. What state or country the person was born in, and if foreign born, are they naturalized? These are incredibly important pieces of information to us as genealogists. We will then be going into occupations for persons 14 years of age and older. We're looking to see if people are working, keeping house, etc., and their specific occupation and industry. Aren't working, are they looking for work? The government is still trying to see if people are not working and why they may be unemployed. The census then inquires if someone is working for the government, a private company, or they own their own business. And that's it. It's a shorter census than 1940. So we're already into the supplemental questions. And this is, again, for 5% of the population. So cross your fingers and toes and whatever else you need to do that hopefully your ancestors are a part of this. You will notice that some of these questions were on the 1940 general census and not the 1940 supplemental, whereas now they're in the 1950 supplemental questions. This is for all ages. Was the person living at the same house a year ago? Just looking at a year instead of 5 years. They go into a little bit more detail with questions 21 and 22, 23. Similar to a supplemental question on the 1940 census, there's a supplemental question on the 1950 census asking what country the person's parents were born in. The next question was on the general 1940 census and not in the supplementary questions. What is the highest grade of school that the person has attended? A follow-up question goes into more detail, asking, did this person finish this grade? And has the person attended school since February 1st? There's some really good information there. A few more questions for the supplemental. It goes into occupations again. However, these questions get into the financial situation of the person in question. The census then inquires further information about occupations, asking how many weeks has someone been looking for work? Last year, how many weeks did this person do any work at all? And then it goes into income received by this person in 1949. And it's very, very detailed, going into how much money did he earn working as an employee for wages or salary? How much money did he earn working in his own business, professional practice, or farm? How much money did he receive from interest, dividends, veterans' allowances, pensions, rents, or other income aside from earnings? The next section gets more detailed if the person is the family head of the household. It inquires about the relations that live in the house and what income they're bringing in. So all of these questions are for the year 1949. Again, they're asking how much money did his relatives in this household earn working for wages or salary? How much money did his relatives in this household earn in own business, professional practice, or farm? How much money did his relatives in this household receive from interest, dividends, veterans' allowances, pensions, rents, or other income aside from earnings? By asking what the other relatives in the household are earning, it acknowledges that women and children and other people in the household could be pulling a wage. The next question is only for males. It inquires if they ever served in the armed forces in World War I, World War II, or at any other time, which I find fascinating considering a lot of women were part of the armed forces. The next part goes into the supplemental questions on marriage. If ever married, has this person been married before? And if married, widowed, divorced, or separated, how many years since the person was married, widowed, divorced, or separated? If female and ever married, how many children has she ever born, not counting stillborns? So there's a lot of information in these supplemental questions that we had in the 1940 census, plus additional information. They create these census forms to find out information based on what's going on in current events. This tells us a little bit about what life was like in 1950. When you're starting the research for this 1950 census, I know we have a little bit over a year, but this is a good time to start thinking about it. It's a good time to make a spreadsheet or a list or a checklist for yourself of what you want to find. You want to make a list of the people you want to look for, those ancestors, the siblings, the friends, the family who could have been living nearby, anyone you have an interest in. Then you want to collect those addresses to find out where they were. One of the best resources are city directories. You can find city directories a lot of times online, but if you can't find it online and you're looking for different places, look at the Library of Congress or contact the Genealogy Center at the Allen County Public Library. There's a lot of city directories available, and sometimes even Google is your friend to tell you where a holding might be. As I stated before, when we were discussing the 1940 census, you want to make sure that you've torn the 1940 census apart as much as possible to glean the information so you can have all of that when going into searching for the 1950 census. The enumeration district from the 1940 census can be converted using the one-step pages by Stephen P. Morse. That's what that wonderful website is at the bottom of the PowerPoint slide. I've given you the web address and the syllabus. If you're not familiar with this website, I would highly recommend making yourself familiar with it. There's a lot of great information in there, but he has a converter from the 1940 census to the 1950 census enumeration district. Hopefully, it'll take you down from hundreds, if not thousands, of pages in the 1950 census to look at to maybe just 30, 40, 50 pages. Use it, see what else you can find. He also has enumeration district maps, so make sure to take a look at those as well. You want to make sure that you use all the information that is given to you. You also want to make sure that you're using the World War II records that are available. You might find draft records, you might find discharge records. The draft records might be a little bit further away from 1950, but you might find that information that you are seeking. Also, if your family member was a part of the Korean War, this is a good time to start looking at those records as well. You might even want to look and see if your family member was naturalized or filled out a declaration of intent close to 1950. The National Archives has a lot of those, but you can also look locally. Check with the state historical society, library, and archive. One of those institutions would be able to help you. And you're going to take all of that information and use it once that 1950 census is released. Where can you find this 1950 census? Well, we're going to take a note from 1940. The 1940 census was released on the National Archives website with its own web address, as you can see from this slide. It was also released on FamilySearch and other paid websites. These are the places that I would recommend looking for the 1950 census when it is released. The National Archive will probably come up with a 1950 census website like they did for the 1940. As with many aspects of this census, we're going to have to stay tuned. Information will be forthcoming as we get closer to the release date. Until then, continue researching, try to figure out where your ancestors were living prior to the 1950 census. Use your fan club, the family, associates, neighbors, or cluster research. Create that chart with names and locations to prepare. And make sure to take a look at Life magazine. It is online, and you can see what life was like for your ancestor or family member around the time that the census was going to be released. Make sure to check that out and include some historical context in your research. Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate you guys taking the time. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions at Roots Tech Connect hosted by FamilySearch. Thank you.